Hey guys, tonight we descend into one of history's most devastating yet misunderstood disasters, the Irish Potato Famine. But let's be clear, this wasn't just about potatoes going bad. This was about power, politics, and the kind of human indifference that makes modern corporate layoffs look compassionate. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Picture this. You're living in a country where your entire food supply depends on one crop. Your government would rather export grain than feed you, and dying of starvation is considered a moral failing. Sound familiar? It should, because the patterns we're about to explore didn't exactly disappear with the 1840s. What we're diving into today makes modern supply chain disruptions look like a minor inconvenience at your local grocery store. Let's be honest, Ireland in the 1840s was basically a colonial experiment gone wrong, wrapped in legal paperwork and served with a side of religious justification. To understand how an entire nation could face starvation while food exports continued flowing out of their ports, we need to peek behind the curtain of what passed for civilization. In pre-famine Ireland, Ireland wasn't technically a colony. Of course. That's right. It was a united kingdom, kind of like how your overbearing roommate isn't technically your landlord. They just happen to control the lease, the utilities, and somehow always eat your food. The Act of Union in 1800 had legally merged Ireland with Great Britain, creating the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. If you thought that meant equal treatment, think again. Meanwhile, the Irish population had exploded to over 8 million people by 1841. To put this in modern perspective, that's like California suddenly doubling its population without building a single new house, road, or McDonald's. The island was packed tighter than a modern music festival, but without the overpriced water bottles or porta-potties. And yet, this massive population survived almost entirely on one crop, the potato. Not potatoes plural with lovely variety, like we see today in the produce section. We're talking about one specific type of potato, the Irish lumper, that had about as much genetic diversity as a boy band. Every single potato plant across the island was essentially a clone, which sounds efficient until you remember what happened to all those identical computers in every sci-fi movie ever made. To be fair, the potato made perfect sense for Irish survival. 1 acre of potatoes could feed twice as many people as an acre of grain, and potatoes required minimal processing. You didn't need mills, ovens, or fancy equipment, just a pot and some water. For a population kept deliberately poor and landless, the potato was like finding the perfect studio apartment. Tiny, humble, but it met all your basic needs. Still, this dependency wasn't exactly accidental. The Irish had been systematically excluded from owning good agricultural land through centuries of confiscation, plantation, and legal restrictions. The best land went to English and Scottish Protestant settlers, while Irish Catholics were pushed onto marginal plots that could barely grow grass, let alone grain crops. Of course, there was plenty of excellent farmland in Ireland, some of the richest soil in Europe, actually. But that land was used to grow wheat, oats, and barley, and to raise cattle and pigs, all for export to England. It's like living next to a 5-star restaurant, but being told you can only eat from the dumpster. Behind it, the land ownership system was a masterclass in economic feudalism with extra steps. Most Irish farmers were tenants, paying rent to landlords who often lived in England and viewed Ireland like a modern landlord views a rental property they've never visited. These absentee landlords hired middlemen to manage their estates, who hired sub-middlemen, who sometimes hired sub-sub-middlemen. By the time you got to the actual farmer, so many people were taking their cut that the rent could be higher than the land's actual productive value. Let's be clear about how this rent system worked. Irish tenants didn't have leases, they had what were called tenancies at will, meaning they could be evicted literally whenever the landlord felt like it. No 30-day notice, no tenant rights, no housing court. Just get out, and maybe some hired muscle to make the point clearer. This created a system where farmers lived in constant fear, never knowing if this harvest would be their last on that particular plot. Meanwhile, the infamous penal laws had spent over a century ensuring that Catholics, the vast majority of the Irish population, couldn't own land, hold public office, practice law, or even own a horse worth more than £5. By the 1840s, most of these laws had been repealed, but their effects lingered like a bad hangover. Generations of systematic exclusion had created a population with no accumulated wealth, no political power, and no economic alternatives. If you thought modern wealth inequality was bad, imagine a society where 97% of the population survived as agricultural laborers, while the remaining 3% controlled virtually all land, wealth, and political power. The average Irish family lived in a one-room mud cabin with a dirt floor, shared with whatever livestock they owned if they were lucky. Enough to own any. That's right, we're talking about housing that would make a modern college dorm room look luxurious. These cabins typically had no windows, no chimney, just a hole in the roof for smoke, and furniture that consisted of maybe a few wooden stools and some straw for bedding. Privacy meant hanging a piece of cloth across the room, and indoor plumbing was a concept that wouldn't reach rural Ireland for another century. And yet, families in these cabins often supported 8, 10, or even 12 people. Children slept wherever they could find space. Adults worked from dawn to dusk, and everyone hoped the potato crop would be good enough to pay the rent and leave something for the family to eat. It was like playing the world's most depressing lottery every single year. The Irish rural economy ran on what economists politely call subsistence agriculture, which is academic speak for barely surviving. Most families grew just enough potatoes to feed themselves and maybe sell a few to pay rent. Everything else, the grain, the livestock, the dairy products, got sold to pay landlords, who used that income to maintain their lifestyle in London. Or Dublin. Sound familiar? It should. This is basically the gig economy of the 1840s, except instead of driving Uber, you were growing food for someone else's profit while hoping you'd have enough left over to eat. And just like modern gig workers, Irish tenants had no job security, no benefits, and no safety net. To be fair, some Irish farmers had slightly better arrangements. The more prosperous ones might rent 30 or 40 acres and employ laborers to help work the land. These farmers, still tenants, mind you, not owners, formed a kind of rural middle class. They ate meat occasionally, lived in houses with actual windows, and could afford to send their children to head schools for basic education. But even these relatively well-off farmers depended on the potato, not just for their own families, but for feeding their laborers. The whole system was built on cheap, reliable potato production. Remove the potato, and the entire house of cards would collapse faster than a cryptocurrency during a bear market. Of course, there were warning signs that this system was unsustainable. Partial potato failures had occurred in 1816, 1821, 1822, and 1831, each causing local hunger and hardship. But these failures were regional and temporary. Within a year or two, potato production bounced back and everyone forgot about the close calls. Still, some people noticed the danger. Agricultural reformers, economists, and even some government officials warned that depending so heavily on one crop was asking for trouble. They suggested diversifying agriculture, improving farming techniques, and investing in alternative food sources. Their advice was ignored with the kind of cheerful confidence that would make modern climate change deniers proud. Meanwhile, Ireland's population continued to grow at a rate that would make rabbits jealous. Young people married early, often in their late teens or early 20s, and immediately started producing children. Large families weren't just common. They were economic necessities. More children meant more workers, and more workers meant a better chance of survival. By the early 1840s, Ireland had reached what population experts call a Malthusian trap, a situation where population growth outstrips the ability to increase food production. The island was essentially living on borrowed time, sustained only by the remarkable productivity of the potato and the willingness of people to accept living standards that would horrify modern observers. If you thought this sounds like a recipe for disaster, congratulations on your basic pattern recognition skills. Ireland in 1845 was like a house built on a foundation of matchsticks during earthquake season. All it would take was one good shake to bring the whole thing tumbling down. The social fabric of Irish rural life was woven tight through necessity and tradition. Extended families lived within walking distance of each other, creating networks of mutual support that had sustained communities through centuries of hardship. When one family faced trouble, neighbors would rally with whatever resources they could spare. It was like having a social safety net made of friendship and obligation, rather than government programs. Of course, this community solidarity was both blessing and curse. When times were good, shared prosperity lifted entire villages. When disaster struck, as it inevitably would, entire communities would sink together. The same networks that provided security in normal times would become sources of additional obligation during crises, as families struggled to help relatives and neighbors who were equally desperate. Still, Irish rural culture had developed remarkable resilience through centuries of surviving marginal conditions. People knew how to stretch food supplies, preserve resources through winter months, and maintain hope through seemingly impossible circumstances. Traditional stories, songs, and celebrations provided psychological sustenance that was almost as important as physical nutrition. And yet, this cultural richness existed alongside grinding poverty that would be unimaginable to modern observers. Families who could recite epic poems from memory might not own a single book. Communities with sophisticated oral traditions might lack basic medical knowledge that could prevent childhood deaths. It was like having a Ferrari engine and a horse-drawn cart. Let's be clear about the gender dynamics of this system. Irish women bore the primary responsibility for managing household resources, caring for children, and maintaining the domestic economy that kept families alive. They had to stretch inadequate food supplies, manage clothing and shelter with minimal resources, and somehow maintain family morale through constant stress and uncertainty. Meanwhile, marriage patterns reflected the harsh economic realities of rural Irish life. Young people couldn't marry until they had access to land, which usually meant waiting for parents to die or for older siblings to emigrate. This created a society where many people remained unmarried well into their 30s, or never married at all. It was like a dating app where the only profile requirement was must-have potato field. That's right, romantic love was a luxury that most Irish people couldn't afford. Marriage was primarily an economic arrangement designed to combine resources and labor for survival. Love might develop after marriage, but it wasn't the foundation of the institution. Passion took a backseat to potato production. To be fair, some couples did marry for love and somehow managed to make it work economically. But these were the exceptions that proved the rule. In a subsistence economy, emotional fulfillment had to be secondary to physical survival. You could have either romance or enough food, but probably not both. Of course, children in this system faced particularly difficult circumstances. They were expected to contribute labor from an early age, often had limited access to education, and knew that most of them would have to leave their families and communities as adults to find economic opportunities elsewhere. Childhood was a brief interlude before the serious business of survival began. Still, Irish families maintained strong emotional bonds despite harsh material circumstances. Parents made enormous sacrifices for their children. Siblings supported each other through difficult times, and extended families provided networks of care that could span generations. Love existed, but it was expressed through practical support rather than material abundance. And yet, perhaps the most remarkable aspect of pre-famine, Irish society was how people maintained dignity and cultural identity despite systematic oppression and grinding poverty. Communities created rich traditions of music, storytelling, and celebration that provided meaning and joy, even in the darkest circumstances. It was like planting flowers in a battlefield. Beautiful, defiant, and somehow essential to human survival. Sound familiar? Modern research on happiness and well-being consistently shows that social connections and cultural meaning matter more for human flourishing than material wealth alone. The Irish had figured this out through necessity long before psychologists started studying it scientifically. Meanwhile, the approach of the 1840s brought subtle signs of change that few people recognized at the time. Young men were beginning to emigrate to Britain for seasonal work, bringing back stories of different ways of life. A few families were experimenting with alternative crops and farming techniques. Some communities were organizing informal schools and discussion groups that challenged traditional authorities. If you thought these changes might have prevented the coming disaster through gradual reform, you underestimate how deeply entrenched the existing system had become. The economic, social, and political structures that made Ireland vulnerable to famine had developed over centuries and couldn't be reformed quickly enough to prevent catastrophe. Let's be honest about what this all adds up to. Ireland in 1845 was a society that had adapted to survive under impossible conditions. But that adaptation had created vulnerabilities that would prove catastrophic when conditions changed. The same dependency and community solidarity that enabled survival in normal times would become sources of shared destruction when crisis struck. That shake was coming, and it had a scientific name, Phytophthora infestans. But we'll get to that in a moment. First, let's appreciate the sheer audacity of a system that kept 8 million people alive on the edge of survival, while simultaneously extracting wealth from their labor to fund the lifestyle of absentee landlords who viewed them as slightly more valuable than livestock. The stage was set for one of the greatest humanitarian disasters in European history. All the pieces were in place: an overpopulated island, a monocrop agricultural system, an extractive colonial economy, and a population with no alternatives and no safety net. The only thing missing was the trigger. Let's be clear about something right up front. What happened in Ireland starting in September 1845 wasn't technically a famine. It was a potato disease that caused a famine, which then caused a political crisis, which then revealed the kind of ideological callousness that makes modern politicians look like humanitarian saints. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The first signs appeared in Waterford and Wexford in September 1845, when farmers noticed their potato plants turning black and rotting in the fields. At first, it seemed like a local problem. Maybe some bad weather, maybe poor seed stock. That's right. People initially thought this was just one of those things that happen sometimes in agriculture, like a bad batch of sourdough starter. Meanwhile, the same blight was already devastating potato crops across northern Europe. It had started in Belgium and the Netherlands earlier that year, spread to Germany and France, and was now making its way across the Irish Sea. If you thought modern global supply chains move fast, this microscopic organism was way ahead of its time in terms of international connectivity. The culprit was Phytophthora infestans, a fungus-like organism that thrived in cool, wet conditions, exactly the kind of weather Ireland was famous for. To be fair, nobody in 1845 knew what caused the blight. Germ theory was still decades away from acceptance, and most people blamed everything from atmospheric conditions to divine punishment for the strange disease turning their food supply into black, stinking mush. Of course, the scientific ignorance wasn't the real problem. The real problem was that when your entire population depends on one genetically identical crop, and that crop gets hit by a disease it has no resistance to, you're about to learn some very expensive lessons about biodiversity. It's like putting all your money in one stock and then acting surprised when the market crashes. Still, even after the 1845 harvest failed, many people remained optimistic. Partial crop failures had happened before, and somehow people had gotten through them. The British government, led by Conservative Prime Minister Sir Robert Peel, initially took the crisis seriously. Peel had visited Ireland and understood the severity of potato dependency. He secretly purchased 100,000 pounds worth of Indian corn from America, what we'd call maize or regular corn today. If you thought that sounds like a reasonable response, you'd be right. But here's where things get interesting. Peel kept this purchase secret because he was afraid of criticism from free market economists who opposed government intervention in food markets. Even in the face of potential starvation, the political priority was maintaining ideological purity about the sacred free market. Let's be honest, this Indian corn purchase was both helpful and completely inadequate. Pound 100,000 sounds impressive until you realize you're trying to feed several million people. It was like bringing a single sandwich to feed a football stadium, then patting yourself on the back for your generous spirit. And yet, Peel's corn did save lives, particularly in the west of Ireland where the potato failure was most severe. The government sold it at cost through public works programs, providing both food and employment. It wasn't enough to prevent hunger, but it prevented mass starvation in 1846. Meanwhile, Peel made a much more significant decision. He repealed the Corn Laws, which had kept grain prices artificially high to protect British landowners. This was a massive political risk that ultimately cost him his job, but it allowed cheaper grain to enter British and Irish markets. Sound familiar? Sometimes doing the right thing in politics means committing career suicide. But just as things seemed manageable, nature decided to double down. The potato blight returned in 1846, and this time it was catastrophic. The disease destroyed nearly the entire potato crop across Ireland. We're talking about a failure rate of 75 to 80%, which in modern terms would be like Amazon's entire delivery system suddenly stopping working right before Christmas. That's right. The 1846 failure was so complete that many farmers didn't even bother harvesting what little remained in their fields. There was no point. The potatoes were black, rotten, and inedible. Families who had hoped to survive on stored potatoes from the previous year found their reserves had also rotted. The disease could destroy harvested potatoes just as easily as those still in the ground. To be fair, some crops other than potatoes were actually doing quite well in 1846. Wheat, oats, and barley harvests were normal or even above average. Ireland was still producing plenty of food, just not the food that Irish people could afford or access. It's like living next to a gourmet restaurant when all you can afford is instant noodles. Except the instant noodles have disappeared and the restaurant is still open, but only accepting payment in currency you don't have. Of course, this is where politics makes everything infinitely worse. In June 1846, Peel's government fell, and Lord John Russell's Whig government took power. Russell and his colleagues were committed to a strict interpretation of laissez-faire economics, which held that government intervention in markets was not just ineffective but morally wrong. Charles Trevelyan, the civil servant put in charge of Irish relief efforts, believed that the famine was God's way of teaching the Irish better economic habits. I wish I was making this up, but Trevelyan literally wrote that the judgment of God sent the calamity to teach the Irish a lesson. If you thought modern disaster response was callous, these people treated mass starvation as a learning opportunity. Let's be clear about what this meant in practice. The Russell government ended Peel's public works programs and corn imports, arguing that private charity and free markets would solve the problem. They genuinely believed that interfering with market forces would make things worse in the long run, even if people died in the short run. Still, they couldn't completely ignore mass starvation, so they implemented their own public works program. But this new program was designed according to strict economic principles. Workers had to do completely useless labor, like building roads to nowhere. They were paid below market wages, and they had to buy their food at market prices. It was like creating a jobs program specifically designed to be as ineffective and demoralizing as possible. Meanwhile, food continued to be exported from Ireland throughout the famine. Ships loaded with grain, livestock, and dairy products left Irish ports every day while people starved on the docks. Irish-grown food was feeding people in England and Europe while Irish people died of hunger. It's the kind of absurd situation that would be unbelievable in a work of fiction, but it happened because economics textbooks said that interfering with trade would make everyone worse off eventually. And yet, there were people who understood exactly what was happening and tried to do something about it. Daniel O'Connell, the famous Irish political leader, warned that government policies were turning a natural disaster into a humanitarian catastrophe. Irish members of Parliament pleaded for food aid, import restrictions, and emergency measures. Their warnings were dismissed as emotional overreactions by people who had never missed a meal by early 1847. It was impossible to ignore the catastrophe unfolding in Ireland. Reports of mass starvation, disease outbreaks, and social collapse were appearing in newspapers across Europe and America. Private charity organizations raised substantial funds. The Quakers alone contributed more relief aid than some governments. But private charity couldn't address a crisis affecting millions of people. If you thought the government might reconsider their approach in the face of overwhelming evidence that it wasn't working, you underestimate the power of ideological commitment. Trevelyan and his colleagues doubled down, arguing that reports of starvation were exaggerated and that providing food aid would create dependency among the Irish poor. That's right. They were worried about creating a culture of dependency among people who were literally dying of starvation. It's like being concerned about enabling someone's swimming addiction while they're drowning, of course. This wasn't just callousness. It was also racism and religious bigotry dressed up in economic theory. Many British officials genuinely believed that the Irish were inherently lazy, improvident, and inferior. The famine wasn't a tragedy. It was proof that the Irish needed to be taught better habits through suffering. Sound familiar? The same attitudes that blamed poor people for their poverty, that treated suffering as character building, and that prioritized ideological purity over human life, didn't disappear in the 19th century. They just found new vocabulary and new justifications. Meanwhile, the blight struck again in 1848, though less severely than in 1846. But by this point, Irish society was already collapsing. Families had sold everything they owned. Communities had exhausted their resources helping each other. And the potato plants themselves were so weakened that even a mild recurrence of the disease could destroy what little remained. Still, some parts of Ireland were affected much worse than others. The western counties, Mayo, Galway, Clare, Kerry, suffered disproportionately because they had the poorest populations and the greatest dependence on potatoes. Eastern areas with more diverse agriculture and better connections to markets fared relatively better. Though better in this context meant only moderate starvation and disease. And yet, even in the worst affected areas, some people managed to survive through a combination of luck, resourcefulness, and community support. Families shared whatever food they could find. Neighbors helped each other with immigration costs, and communities organized informal relief efforts that sometimes worked better than official government programs. Let's be honest, the people who survived the famine weren't necessarily the strongest or smartest or most deserving. They were often simply the luckiest. Lucky to live near a port with immigration opportunities. Lucky to have relatives who had immigrated earlier and could send money. Lucky to live in areas where the blight was less severe or where landlords were more generous. To be fair, some landlords did try to help their tenants during the crisis. A few provided emergency food, reduced rents, or paid for emigration passages. But these were exceptions, and even well-intentioned landlords often lacked the resources to support hundreds or thousands of starving tenants. By 1849, the immediate crisis was ending. The potato blight had largely disappeared. New varieties of potatoes were being introduced, and alternative crops were being planted. But the damage was already done. Ireland had lost approximately 1 million people to starvation and disease, and another million had emigrated. The island's population had dropped by 25% in just 4 years. Of course, calling this period the end of the famine misses the point. The immediate crisis might have been over, but the social, economic, and cultural damage would take generations to heal. Entire communities had been destroyed. Traditional ways of life had disappeared, and the relationship between Ireland and Britain had been permanently poisoned. If you thought this disaster might lead to some serious reflection about the wisdom of free market fundamentalism and colonial exploitation, you'd be disappointed. The official conclusion was that the famine proved the need for more economic modernization and less government interference. It's like concluding from a house fire that you need less fire insurance and more matches. Still, the Irish Potato Famine became one of the first modern humanitarian crises to receive international attention and aid. It established patterns of disaster response, emigration, and international charity that would be repeated many times over the following century and a half. Meanwhile, the political consequences were just beginning. The famine had destroyed traditional Irish rural society, but it had also created a diaspora that would carry Irish grievances and Irish nationalism around the world. The seeds of Irish independence, Irish American political power, and Irish cultural revival were all planted in the mass graves and emigrant ships of the famine years. And yet, perhaps the most important lesson of the Irish potato famine isn't about potatoes, or even about famines. It's about what happens when ideology becomes more important than humanity, when economic theories matter more than human lives, and when the people making decisions never have to live with the consequences of those decisions. Let's be honest about what starvation actually looks like, because Hollywood has given us a very sanitized version of hunger. In the movies, people get romantically thin and maybe faint gracefully. In reality, starvation is a slow, ugly, degrading process that strips away everything we consider civilized about human society. And in Ireland between 1846 and 1849, millions of people got to experience this process firsthand. The first stage of serious hunger isn't dramatic. It's just constant. You wake up thinking about food. You go to bed thinking about food. And every moment in between is colored by the gnawing awareness that your stomach is empty. That's right. Before people start dying, they start obsessing. Conversations that used to be about weather, gossip, or local news suddenly revolve entirely around food. Who has any? Where to get some? What happened to the potatoes that were supposed to last until spring? Meanwhile, families began making calculations that no human should have to make. With limited food available, How do you decide who gets the larger portion? Do you feed the children first, hoping they'll survive to adulthood? Do you prioritize the adults who can work and potentially earn money for food? Do you try to keep everyone alive at subsistence levels, or do you sacrifice some to save others? To be fair, these weren't abstract ethical dilemmas discussed in philosophy classes. These were daily decisions made by parents who could watch their children getting weaker every day. Irish mothers would go without food so their children could eat, then watch those same children waste away because even the mother's sacrifice wasn't enough to provide adequate nutrition. Sound familiar? It should, because these impossible choices didn't end with the Irish famine. They're being made right now by families facing food insecurity around the world. The specific circumstances change, but the fundamental cruelty of having to choose who gets to eat remains depressingly constant. Of course, hunger affects more than just your stomach. As malnutrition sets in, people lose energy, become irritable, and find it difficult to concentrate. Simple tasks become exhausting. Walking to the next village might as well be climbing Mount Everest. Children stop playing, adults stop socializing, and entire communities become focused solely on the basic mechanics of survival. Still, Irish families tried to maintain normal routines as long as possible. Children still attended hedge schools when they had the strength. Adults still gathered for traditional celebrations, even if there was no food to share. People still told stories, sang songs, and tried to preserve some sense of community identity. It was like keeping the lights on in a house that was slowly collapsing around you. And yet, maintaining these routines became increasingly difficult as physical weakness set in. Severe malnutrition causes muscle wasting, making even basic farm work impossible. People who had spent their lives engaged in heavy physical labor found themselves unable to lift tools or walk long distances. The very work that might have earned money for food became impossible to perform. Let's be clear about what impossible meant in this context. We're not talking about people being a little tired or lacking motivation. We're talking about bodies that had consumed all available fat reserves and were now breaking down muscle tissue for energy. People literally couldn't generate enough physical force to swing an axe or carry a bucket of water. If you thought malnutrition just made people thin, think again. Advanced starvation causes a condition called kwashiorkor, where the body retains fluid, causing swollen bellies, faces, and limbs. Victims look bloated rather than skinny, which created the cruel irony of appearing well-fed while actually dying of hunger. Irish children with distended stomachs were sometimes accused of hiding food when they were actually in the final stages of starvation. Meanwhile, hunger began changing social relationships in ways that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. Neighbors who had shared resources for generations began hoarding whatever food they could find. Extended families split apart as each nuclear family focused on its own survival. Traditional forms of mutual aid broke down under the pressure of universal need. That's right, the famine didn't just kill people. It killed the social bonds that had held Irish rural communities together. When everyone is starving, traditional obligations to help others become literally impossible to fulfill. You can't share food you don't have, and you can't help your neighbors when you're too weak to help yourself. To be fair, this breakdown of social solidarity wasn't immediate or complete. Many families continued sharing resources and supporting each other long after it became economically irrational to do so. Irish communities showed remarkable resilience and mutual aid throughout the crisis. But eventually, even the strongest social bonds couldn't survive the pressure of universal starvation. Of course, as food became scarce, people began eating things that would have been unthinkable in normal times. Grass, weeds, tree bark, and anything else that might provide some nutrition went into cooking pots. Irish folklore from the famine years includes references to famine foods, various plants and organic materials that people consumed in desperate attempts to fill their stomachs. Sound familiar? Every major famine in history produces similar stories of people eating grass, bark, and other non-food items. It's one of the universal patterns of starvation. When real food disappears, humans will try to survive on anything that might provide calories, regardless of taste or nutritional value. Still, eating grass and weeds often made things worse rather than better. These materials can cause digestive problems, nutrient malabsorption, and in some cases, poisoning. People who thought they were feeding themselves were sometimes actually accelerating their own deaths. But when you're starving, any action feels better than inaction, even if it's ultimately counterproductive. And yet, some people did find genuine alternative food sources that helped them survive. Coastal communities increased their reliance on seaweed, shellfish, and whatever fish they could catch. Inland, people scavenged for wild berries, nuts, and edible roots. These weren't pleasant foods, but they provided actual nutrition and probably saved thousands of lives. Let's be honest, the people who survived the famine often did so through a combination of resourcefulness, community support, and sheer luck. Those who lived near the coast had access to seafood. Those with relatives who had emigrated earlier might receive money from America. Those who happened to live in areas where the blight was less severe had more options for survival. Meanwhile, the physical effects of starvation were accompanied by psychological trauma that would last for generations. Children who lived through the famine developed anxiety around food that they carried throughout their lives. Adults who watched family members die of hunger suffered from what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. If you thought people just got over experiences like this, you underestimate how deeply trauma can affect human psychology. Famine survivors often developed compulsive hoarding behaviors, extreme frugality, and persistent anxiety about food security. These psychological patterns were then passed down to their children and grandchildren, creating multi-generational effects that lasted long after the immediate crisis ended. That's right. The Irish famine didn't just affect the people who lived through it. It shaped the attitudes and behaviors of their descendants for generations. Irish-American families maintained traditions of food preservation, emergency preparedness, and community mutual aid that reflected their ancestors' experiences during the famine years. That, to be fair, these survival behaviors served people well in many contexts. The resourcefulness, frugality, and community solidarity that developed during the famine became valuable traits that helped Irish immigrants succeed in new countries. Crisis-forged resilience often becomes a source of strength in later challenges. Of course, starvation also brought out the worst in human nature. Desperate people sometimes stole food from neighbors, abandoned elderly relatives who couldn't work, or made other morally compromising choices in the interest of survival. The famine created situations where decent people were forced to act in ways they would have found abhorrent under normal circumstances. Still, what's remarkable about the Irish famine isn't how often people behaved badly under extreme pressure, but how often they continued to behave with dignity and compassion despite having every excuse to be selfish. Families shared their last scraps of food with hungry strangers. Communities organized informal relief efforts even when they had almost nothing to give. People maintained religious practices, cultural traditions, and social obligations even in the face of starvation. And yet, the most heartbreaking aspect of famine life wasn't the hunger itself. It was watching children suffer. Parents who had worked their entire lives to provide for their families found themselves powerless to prevent their children from wasting away. The normal protective instincts that define parenthood became sources of torture when there was literally nothing parents could do to help their starving children. Let's be clear about what this meant in practical terms. Irish parents watched their children stop growing, lose their hair, develop sores that wouldn't heal, and gradually become too weak to walk or play. They listened to children crying from hunger and had no food to give them. They held children who were dying from malnutrition and could only offer comfort, not nourishment. Meanwhile, the children who did survive often suffered permanent developmental damage from malnutrition, stunted growth, learning disabilities, and weakened immune systems were common among famine survivors. The effects of childhood hunger didn't end when food became available again. They lasted for entire lifetimes. If you thought this kind of suffering would generate sympathy from those who had the power to help, you'd be disappointed. Government officials and wealthy landlords often blamed Irish families for their children's condition, arguing that better planning or harder work could have prevented the crisis. It's like blaming people for getting wet in a hurricane. Sound familiar? The tendency to blame victims for their suffering, to assume that poverty results from moral failings rather than circumstances, didn't disappear with the 19th century. It just found new vocabulary and new target populations. Of course, not everyone in Ireland was starving. The Protestant minority, concentrated in Ulster and in towns throughout the island, generally had better access to resources and alternative food sources. Landlords, merchants, and professionals might experience inconvenience and higher food prices, but they rarely faced actual starvation. That's right. The famine was fundamentally a class-based disaster. The people who died were overwhelmingly poor, rural, Catholic, and Irish-speaking. The people who survived were disproportionately wealthy, urban, Protestant, and English-speaking. This wasn't coincidence. It reflected the underlying social and economic structures that made some people vulnerable to famine while protecting others. Still, even among the poor, some groups suffered more than others. Landless laborers had fewer resources than tenant farmers. Large families had more mouths to feed than small ones. People in remote western areas had fewer options than those near towns or ports. The famine affected almost everyone, but it didn't affect everyone equally. And yet, perhaps the most important thing to understand about daily life during the Irish famine is how quickly normal disappeared. Within months, behaviors and experiences that would have been unthinkable became routine. People adapted to circumstances that should have been unbearable, because the alternative was giving up entirely. By the worst months of 1847, walking through Irish villages was like touring a disaster zone. Empty houses with doors hanging open, fields left uncultivated because there was no one strong enough to work them. Crowds of skeletal beggars following anyone who looked like they might have food. Mass graves being dug because individual burials had become impossible. Let's be honest. This wasn't temporary hardship that people could endure by tightening their belts. This was social collapse, the breakdown of everything that makes human civilization possible. And the most remarkable thing about it is how many people maintained their humanity, even in the face of complete systemic failure. To be fair, understanding what daily life was like during the Irish famine requires remembering that most of the people who lived through it couldn't write detailed accounts of their experiences. The poor, uneducated majority left few written records. Most of what we know comes from the observations of landlords, government officials, and relief workers, people who witnessed the suffering but didn't experience it firsthand. Still, the accounts we do have paint a consistent picture. A society where normal life became impossible, where survival required constant vigilance and difficult choices, and where death was a daily companion rather than a distant possibility. It was like living in a post-apocalyptic movie, except there were no heroes coming to rescue everyone and no clear end in sight. Of course, while Irish peasants were eating grass and watching their children waste away, life in Ireland's great. Houses continued with remarkable normalcy that would have been comical if it wasn't so tragic. That's right, we need to talk about what was happening on the other side of the class divide during the famine years, because understanding how the wealthy and powerful responded to mass starvation tells us everything we need to know about human nature, political priorities, and the infinite capacity for moral blindness when it serves your interests. Let's be honest about the setup here. Ireland in the 1840s had some of the most dramatic wealth inequality in Europe, making modern billionaire wealth gaps look almost quaint by comparison. While millions of people survived on tiny plots of rented land, eating potatoes and living in one-room mud cabins, a few hundred families controlled vast estates, grand mansions, and most of the island's wealth. These weren't just rich people. They were rich people who derived their wealth directly from the labor of the people who were now starving. Meanwhile, many of Ireland's largest landowners didn't even live in Ireland, preferring the comforts of London society to the inconvenience of managing their Irish properties. These absentee landlords resided in fashionable English locations, visiting their Irish estates occasionally like modern executives visiting overseas factories. They knew their properties generated substantial rental income, but they had about as much personal connection to their Irish tenants as modern shareholders have to factory workers in distant countries. To be fair, some resident landlords did try to help their tenants during the crisis, demonstrating that wealth and power don't automatically destroy human compassion. A few reduced rents, provided emergency food supplies, or paid for emigration passages to America. These were genuine acts of generosity that probably saved thousands of lives and showed that different choices were possible for those with resources, but they were exceptions that proved the rule. And even well-intentioned landlords often lacked the resources to support hundreds or thousands of starving tenants without bankrupting themselves. The scale of the crisis was simply too large for individual generosity to address, no matter how sincere or well-funded. Sound familiar? It's like expecting individual billionaires to solve climate change through personal charity, while the system that created the problem continues unchanged. Individual generosity, no matter how well-intentioned, can address systemic disasters that require systemic solutions. Still, the majority of Irish landlords responded to the famine with a combination of denial, blame-shifting, and self-interest. That would make modern crisis management consultants proud of their PR skills. Many genuinely believed that their tenants were exaggerating the severity of the situation to avoid paying rent. After all, Irish peasants had always claimed to be poor. How could landlords distinguish between routine complaints and actual starvation? And yet, the evidence of catastrophe was impossible to ignore for anyone who actually looked. Estate managers reported finding entire families dead in their cabins. Local magistrates described scenes of mass starvation that defied belief. Even government officials acknowledged that the crisis was unprecedented in scale and severity. The information was available to anyone who wanted to see it. If you thought this overwhelming evidence might prompt landlords to reconsider their assumptions about Irish exaggeration, you underestimate the power of self-interested reasoning, combined with ethnic prejudice. Many landlords concluded that the reports of starvation proved their tenants had been living beyond their means all along. The famine wasn't a tragedy. It was a natural correction that would teach the Irish better economic habits. Let's be clear about what this meant in practice. While people died of hunger, landlords continued demanding rent payments with the persistence of modern debt collectors. Families who couldn't pay were evicted from their holdings, often during winter months when finding alternative shelter was impossible. The same landlords who expressed sympathy for their tenants' suffering felt no contradiction in making that suffering worse through evictions. That's right, evictions actually increased during the famine years. revealing the priorities of a system that valued property rights over human life. Between 1846 and 1854, over 250,000 people were formally evicted from their homes, and many more were pressured to leave voluntarily. These weren't people who had been chronically delinquent on rent. These were families who had paid their obligations for years, but couldn't continue during a natural disaster. Meanwhile, the eviction process itself was designed to be as efficient and heartless as possible, like a bureaucratic machine for manufacturing homelessness. Landlords would arrive with bailiffs, crowbars, and sometimes military escorts to physically remove families from their homes. The cabins would then be tumbled, deliberately destroyed to prevent reoccupation. Families would be left standing beside piles of rubble that had been their homes hours earlier. Of course, landlords had their own financial pressures that they used to justify these actions. Many Irish estates were heavily mortgaged, and English creditors expected regular payments regardless of Irish agricultural disasters. Landlords who showed too much mercy to their tenants might face bankruptcy themselves. It's like being caught between loan sharks and humanitarian obligations, except the loan sharks had legal backing and the humanitarian obligations were just moral suggestions. To be fair, some landlords were genuinely trapped by financial circumstances beyond their immediate control. The Irish estate system was often a house of cards, where rental income from hundreds of small tenants was used to pay debts to English banks and investors. When rental income disappeared due to the famine, the entire financial structure collapsed, like a Ponzi scheme during an economic crisis. Still, many landlords had options they chose not to exercise. They could have sold assets, borrowed against future income, or appealed to wealthy relatives for emergency funds. Instead, they chose to maintain their lifestyle by extracting whatever resources they could from starving tenants. It's like choosing to keep your yacht while your employees lose their homes and health insurance. Sound familiar? The pattern of socializing losses while privatizing gains didn't begin with modern corporate bailouts. Irish landlords expected their tenants to absorb all the costs of agricultural disaster, while landlords maintained their standard of living through evictions and aggressive rent collection. And yet, perhaps the most galling aspect of landlord behavior during the famine was their tendency to blame their tenants for the crisis while simultaneously profiting from their suffering. Many landlords genuinely believed that Irish poverty resulted from laziness, improvidence, and moral failings, rather than systemic exploitation. The famine wasn't caused by potato blight and economic inequality. It was caused by Irish character defects that could be corrected through suffering. Let's be honest about where these attitudes came from. Centuries of colonial propaganda had taught English and Anglo-Irish elites that the Irish were inherently inferior, lazy, dishonest, violent, and incapable of self-improvement. The famine seemed to confirm these prejudices for people who wanted them confirmed. After all, if the Irish were capable and hard-working, wouldn't they have developed more resilient agricultural systems? Meanwhile, this blame the victim mentality extended to the highest levels of government, where civil servants treated mass starvation as a learning opportunity. Charles Trevelyan, the civil servant overseeing famine relief, wrote extensively about how the crisis would ultimately benefit Ireland by forcing the adoption of better economic practices. Mass starvation wasn't a humanitarian disaster. It was educational therapy. If you thought government officials might show more compassion than private landlords, think again. Trevelyan and his colleagues combined ideological rigidity with racial prejudice in ways that made individual landlord selfishness look almost benign by comparison. At least landlords were motivated by personal financial interest. Government officials were motivated by abstract economic theories and ethnic superiority complexes. That's right, the British government's response to mass starvation in Ireland was shaped by the same attitudes that justified colonialism worldwide. The Irish weren't starving because of policy failures or natural disasters. They were starving because they were Irish, and starvation would teach them to be more like the English. It was like blaming a house fire on the people inside, while preventing them from leaving. To be fair, not all government officials shared these attitudes. Some local administrators, military officers, and civil servants tried to provide effective relief despite official policies that prioritized ideology over humanitarian concerns. These individuals often risked their careers by exceeding their authority or openly criticizing government policies that they could see were failing. Of course, the most surreal aspect of the government response was the insistence on maintaining normal economic activities while people starved in the streets. Food exports from Ireland continued throughout the famine years, like maintaining luxury exports during a zombie apocalypse. Ships loaded with grain, meat, and dairy products left Irish ports daily, while Irish people died of hunger on the docks watching them leave. Still, this wasn't simple oversight or bureaucratic inefficiency. It was deliberate policy based on free market economic theory that had achieved religious status among government officials. They genuinely believed that interfering with food exports would make the crisis worse by discouraging future agricultural investment. They were willing to let people starve to preserve abstract economic principles. And yet, the cognitive dissonance required to maintain these policies was extraordinary, requiring mental gymnastics that would impress Olympic athletes. Government officials could write detailed reports about mass starvation while simultaneously authorizing food exports. They could express sympathy for Irish suffering while implementing policies that increased that suffering. It's like being a vegetarian who owns a slaughterhouse and doesn't see the contradiction. Sound familiar? The ability to compartmentalize moral concerns from policy decisions, to express sympathy while implementing cruelty, didn't disappear with the Victorian era. Modern politicians regularly express concern about problems they're actively making worse through their policy choices, using the same psychological mechanisms. Let's be clear about the international context here. The Irish famine was happening during a period of general European prosperity and peace. Britain was the world's wealthiest nation, with unprecedented industrial capacity and global reach. The resources to prevent mass starvation in Ireland absolutely existed. They just weren't deployed because it would have violated ideological principles. Meanwhile, private charity from Britain, America, and other countries provided more effective relief than official government programs, demonstrating that resources and goodwill existed but weren't being channeled through official channels. Quaker organizations, Catholic charities, and individual donors raised substantial funds for Irish relief. These private efforts saved thousands of lives, but they also highlighted the inadequacy of official responses. If you thought private charity might shame governments into more effective action, you'd be disappointed by the infinite capacity for rationalization when it serves political interests. Government officials often criticize private relief efforts for creating dependency and interfering with market mechanisms. It's like complaining that firefighters are creating a culture of dependency among people whose houses are burning down. That's right. The same officials who did nothing to prevent starvation criticized those who tried to address it. Private charity was seen as undermining the moral lessons that starvation was supposed to teach. Helping people survive was actually harmful because it prevented them from learning proper economic behavior through suffering. The logic was perfect if you ignored the human cost. To be fair, some private relief efforts were genuinely problematic, demonstrating that good intentions don't automatically produce good results. Well-meaning but ignorant donors sometimes provided inappropriate aid or created distribution systems that favored some groups over others. But these failures of execution pale in comparison to the deliberate policy of allowing mass starvation to continue for ideological reasons. Of course, the most revealing aspect of elite behavior during the famine was how they protected themselves and their interests while expecting others to make sacrifices for the greater good. Landlords maintained their lifestyle through evictions while preaching about Irish improvidence. Government officials preserved their salaries and pensions while lecturing about the need for fiscal responsibility. Still, perhaps the most damning evidence of elite callousness was their reaction when the famine finally ended. Instead of acknowledging policy failures or expressing remorse for preventable deaths, most officials and landlords congratulated themselves on teaching the Irish valuable economic lessons. The million dead weren't victims of policy failure. They were casualties of necessary modernization. And yet, this self-congratulation couldn't hide the obvious fact that British policy in Ireland had been a humanitarian catastrophe and a public relations disaster that damaged Britain's international reputation. International opinion turned sharply against Britain. Irish-American communities became permanently radicalized, and the moral authority of British rule in Ireland was permanently damaged. Let's be honest, the famine response revealed something fundamental about how power operates in crisis situations. When faced with a choice between maintaining ideological consistency and preventing mass death, British officials chose ideology. When forced to choose between preserving wealth and saving lives, most landlords chose wealth. These weren't accidental decisions. They were deliberate choices that reflected clear priorities. Meanwhile, the patterns established during the Irish famine would be repeated throughout the British Empire and beyond, creating a template for how colonial powers would respond to humanitarian crises. Natural disasters would be used as opportunities to implement unpopular economic policies. Humanitarian crises would be blamed on the moral failings of victims rather than policy failures. Relief efforts would be designed to reinforce social hierarchies rather than save lives. If you thought the Irish famine might serve as a cautionary tale about the dangers of ideological extremism and economic inequality, you'd be both right and wrong. It did become a cautionary tale, but mostly for Irish people and other colonized populations who learned not to expect help from imperial governments. For the people in power, it became a template for managing future crises while maintaining control. Sound familiar? The Irish famine established patterns of crisis response that persist today. Blame victims, protect existing power structures, prioritize abstract principles over human lives, and declare success regardless of outcomes. The specific ideologies change, but the underlying patterns remain depressingly consistent across time and cultures. That's right. Understanding elite behavior during the Irish famine isn't just historical curiosity. It's a masterclass in how power operates during humanitarian crises. The names and faces change, but the fundamental dynamics of protecting privilege while sacrificing the vulnerable remain remarkably constant across different political systems and historical periods. To be fair, not everyone in positions of power behaved badly during the famine. Some individuals risked their careers, spent their fortunes, and sacrificed their comfort to help starving Irish families. These exceptions prove that different choices were possible, which makes the behavior of the majority even more inexcusable and morally damning. Of course, the real tragedy isn't that some people behaved badly during a crisis. It's that the crisis was largely preventable and certainly manageable with the resources available. The Irish famine wasn't an unstoppable natural disaster like an asteroid impact. It was a policy choice disguised as economic necessity and justified through racial prejudice. Still, perhaps the most important lesson from elite behavior during the Irish famine is how ordinary moral people can become complicit in extraordinary cruelty through institutional structures and ideological frameworks. Most of the officials and landlords involved weren't monsters. They were normal people operating within systems that rewarded callousness and punished compassion. And yet, that may be the most frightening lesson of all. The Irish famine wasn't caused by uniquely evil individuals. It was caused by normal people making rational choices within irrational systems, which suggests that similar disasters can happen anywhere, anytime, when the right combination of ideology, inequality, and institutional failure creates the conditions for preventable suffering. Let's be clear about something. When people talk about Irish immigration to America, they often romanticize it as a brave journey toward opportunity and freedom, complete with inspirational music and sepia-toned photographs. But for most famine-era immigrants, leaving Ireland wasn't an adventure. It was a desperate escape from death. We're talking about people who sold everything they owned, borrowed money they couldn't repay, and risked their lives on dangerous ocean voyages because staying home meant watching their families starve in real time. The numbers alone tell the story of desperation with mathematical precision. In the decade between 1845 and 1855, over 1.5 million people left Ireland, nearly 20% of the entire population. To put that in modern perspective, that's like California losing 8 million people in 10 years, or like the entire population of Phoenix simply disappearing. We're not talking about a gradual migration pattern. We're talking about mass evacuation from a disaster zone. Meanwhile, these weren't the prosperous farmers or skilled craftsmen who might have emigrated during normal times in search of better opportunities and the American dream. These were the poorest of the poor, landless laborers, small tenant farmers, and people who had literally nothing left to lose except their lives. Many had never been more than 20 miles from their birthplace. And suddenly, they were contemplating journeys across an ocean to places they couldn't even imagine. That's right. Most Irish immigrants during the famine years had no realistic idea what they were getting into. Like booking a vacation to a destination you've never heard of based on a brochure written in a foreign language. America existed in their minds as a vague concept of not starving, rather than a specific destination with known conditions, job markets, or cultural expectations. They were like people jumping from a burning building without knowing what was below. Anything had to be better than staying. To be fair, the decision to emigrate wasn't usually made by individuals acting alone. It was made by families, communities, and sometimes entire villages collectively, like a group survival strategy. Families would pool their resources to send their strongest members abroad, hoping those immigrants would find work and send money back to help the rest escape. It was like a lifeboat strategy. Save whoever you can and hope they can come back. For the others, of course, pooling resources for emigration meant making impossible choices about who should go first. Decisions that would haunt families for generations. Do you send the young men who are most likely to find work? Do you send the women and children who are most vulnerable to starvation? Do you send the healthy members who can survive the journey, or the sick ones who will die if they stay? Irish families had to make these decisions with no good information and no guarantee that any choice would work. Sound familiar? It should, because these same impossible choices are being made by refugee families around the world right now. The specific circumstances change, but the fundamental dilemma of choosing who gets saved first remains heartbreakingly constant across different disasters and historical periods. Still, even families who manage to scrape together emigration funds face the enormous challenge of actually getting out of Ireland, which was like trying to escape from a prison designed by sadistic economists. Transportation to ports was difficult and expensive. Passage to America cost more money than most families had ever seen at one time. And the whole process was controlled by ship captains, agents, and middlemen who saw desperate Irish immigrants as easy targets for exploitation. And yet, some people did manage to escape, often through a combination of sacrifice, luck, and help. From relatives who had emigrated earlier, creating networks of survival that spanned continents. The Irish immigration pattern was heavily dependent on what historians call chain migration. Earlier immigrants would send money back to Ireland to pay for family members to join them. This created networks of support that made mass emigration possible, but also created enormous pressure on the first immigrants to succeed. Let's be honest about what these early immigrants faced when they reached America. The journey itself was often as dangerous as staying in Ireland, like choosing between two different ways of dying. Ships were overcrowded, unsanitary, and poorly provisioned. Passengers were packed into cargo holds with minimal food, water, or medical care. Diseases spread rapidly in these conditions, and many immigrants died during the voyage without ever seeing their promised land. If you thought ship captains might show some concern for passenger welfare, you underestimate the power of profit margins combined with ethnic prejudice. These weren't cruise ships, they were cargo vessels, hastily converted to carry human freight with about as much concern for passenger comfort as modern airlines show for cattle. Captains made money by packing as many passengers as possible into the smallest space, regardless of safety or comfort. The ships carrying Irish immigrants became known as coffin ships, and the nickname wasn't metaphorical or exaggerated for dramatic effect. On some voyages, 20% or more of passengers died during the crossing from disease, malnutrition, or simple overcrowding. Bodies were thrown overboard daily, and survivors arrived in American ports traumatized, diseased, and often too weak to work. It was like escaping one disaster only to endure another one. Meanwhile, the immigrants who did survive the journey faced a reception in America that was often hostile and discriminatory, proving that escaping famine didn't mean escaping prejudice. Irish Catholics were seen as inferior, dirty, and potentially dangerous by the Protestant majority. No Irish need apply signs were common in employment advertisements. Irish neighborhoods were overcrowded slums where disease and poverty were nearly as bad as what immigrants had left behind in Ireland. That's right. Many Irish immigrants discovered that escape from starvation didn't necessarily mean escape from poverty, discrimination, or suffering. They had traded one set of problems for another, and many spent the rest of their lives wondering if they had made the right choice. The Promised Land had promises that weren't always kept. To be fair, despite these challenges, emigration did save lives that would have been lost to starvation or disease in Ireland. Whatever hardships Irish immigrants faced in America, Canada, or Australia, they were generally better than starving to death in a mud cabin. And over time, many immigrants did manage to build better lives for themselves and their families through hard work, mutual support, and sheer determination. Of course, the most heartbreaking aspect of famine immigration wasn't the physical hardships. It was the permanent separation from family and homeland that tore apart social networks that existed for centuries. In an era before reliable international communication, leaving Ireland often meant never seeing family members again. Immigrants might receive occasional letters, but they had no idea if their relatives were alive or dead, thriving or suffering. Familiar? Modern technology has made communication easier, but the fundamental emotional cost of forced migration remains the same. Leaving your homeland because you have no choice, not knowing if you'll ever return, carries psychological wounds that never fully heal regardless of material success. Still, Irish immigrants maintained connections to home through letters, money transfers, and cultural practices that they carried with them to new countries like precious cargo. Irish music, dance, storytelling traditions, and religious practices were preserved and adapted in immigrant communities around the world. It was like carrying pieces of Ireland in their luggage, even when they couldn't carry much else. And yet, these cultural connections often created tension within immigrant families as they tried to balance preservation of heritage with adaptation to new environments. Parents who remembered Ireland wanted to preserve traditional ways of life, while children born in America wanted to assimilate into their new society. Second-generation Irish Americans often felt caught between two worlds, fully accepted by neither. Let's be clear about the long-term consequences of famine emigration. The Irish diaspora that resulted from the 1840s crisis created Irish communities in dozens of countries around the world. These communities maintained political connections to Ireland, supported independence movements, and eventually provided the financial and political resources that helped Ireland gain independence from Britain. Meanwhile, the trauma forced emigration became part of Irish identity in ways that lasted for generations, creating a global Irish consciousness that transcended national boundaries. Irish Americans maintained a sense of grievance against Britain that influenced American foreign policy for over a century. The Irish famine became a founding myth for Irish nationalism, providing moral justification for political violence and independence movements. If you thought emigrants might gradually forget their grievances against British rule as they built new lives in America, you underestimate the power of inherited trauma and collective memory. Irish American communities passed down stories of famine suffering and British callousness from generation to generation. Children and grandchildren who had never seen Ireland grew up with fierce hatred for British policies their ancestors had experienced. That's right. The Irish famine created a global Irish diaspora that remained politically and emotionally connected to Irish independence long after the original emigrants had died. This had enormous consequences for both Irish and British history throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, influencing everything from American foreign policy to funding for Irish revolutionary movements. To be fair, not all Irish emigrants maintained strong connections to Ireland or harbored resentment against Britain. Many were simply grateful to escape poverty and build better lives in their new countries. Some deliberately distanced themselves from Irish identity to avoid discrimination and improve their chances of social advancement in societies that viewed Irishness as a liability. Of course, the selectivity of emigration also had important consequences for Ireland itself, creating a demographic drain that weakened the country's capacity for recovery. The people who left were often the youngest, strongest, and most ambitious members of their communities. This brain drain weakened Ireland's capacity for economic and social recovery by removing many of the people who might have led reconstruction efforts after the famine ended. Still, emigration also provided crucial economic support for people who remained in Ireland through remittances that kept many families alive. Money sent back by immigrants, called American letters when they contained cash, helped families survive the worst years of the famine and provided capital for recovery afterwards. Irish immigrants abroad became Ireland's most important source of foreign investment and economic support. And yet, this dependence on immigrant remittances created its own problems for Irish economic development. Irish communities became economically dependent on maintaining connections to immigrants, which discouraged local economic development and created a culture of emigration as the primary solution to economic hash. What it was really like to live through the Irish famine, of course. Talking about the Irish famine without addressing the diseases that accompanied starvation would be like discussing a house fire while ignoring the smoke. Let's be clear about something. Most people during the famine years didn't actually die from hunger alone. They died from the diseases that thrive when immune systems collapse, sanitation fails, and desperate people crowd together in unsanitary conditions. It's like starvation opened the door, but disease was what actually killed most of the victims. Meanwhile, Understanding the medical horror of the famine requires recognizing that Ireland in the 1840s had virtually no public health infrastructure and medical knowledge that would seem primitive by modern standards. There were no antibiotics, no understanding of germ theory, and no systematic approach to preventing disease outbreaks. When epidemics struck weakened populations, medical professionals were essentially helpless to stop them. That's right, Irish. Doctors during the famine were like firefighters trying to fight blazes with buckets of water. They could see the disasters unfolding. They understood that people were dying, but they lacked the tools and knowledge to address the underlying causes of disease. Most treatments were based on folk medicine, religious faith, and trial and error. Approaches that often did more harm than good, to be fair. Some medical professionals did heroic work during the crisis, risking their own lives to treat patients they knew they probably couldn't save. Local doctors, priests, and volunteers worked tirelessly to provide whatever comfort and care they could, even when medical intervention was essentially useless. These individuals deserve recognition for their courage and compassion in the face of overwhelming catastrophe. Sound familiar? Modern medical professionals working in disaster zones face similar challenges when infrastructure collapses and resources become inadequate to address the scale of human suffering. The specific diseases and treatments change, but the fundamental challenge of providing medical care during humanitarian crises remains remarkably consistent. Still, the diseases that swept through Ireland during the famine years were particularly devastating because they targeted populations already weakened by malnutrition. Typhus, typhoid fever, dysentery, and cholera spread rapidly through communities where people lacked clean water, adequate shelter, and sufficient nutrition to maintain immune system function. It was like a perfect storm of biological warfare against vulnerable populations. And yet, these weren't exotic tropical diseases or mysterious plagues. They were preventable illnesses that thrived in conditions of poverty, overcrowding, and poor sanitation. Typhus was spread by body lice that proliferated when people couldn't maintain basic hygiene. Dysentery resulted from contaminated water supplies. Cholera spread through communities that lacked proper sewage systems. These diseases were symptoms of social breakdown as much as biological problems. Let's be honest about what these diseases actually did to human bodies weakened by starvation. Typhus caused high fevers, severe headaches, and a characteristic rash that spread across the body. Victims often became delirious, unable to recognize family members or understand their surroundings. Death came through organ failure, brain swelling, or simple exhaustion as the body's systems shut down one by one. If you thought starvation was the worst way to die during the famine, you underestimate the agony of dying from disease while conscious and aware of your suffering. Cholera caused severe dehydration through violent diarrhea and vomiting. Victims could lose enormous amounts of body fluid in hours, leaving them looking skeletal and blue-skinned before death. It was like watching someone's body literally drain away while they remained conscious. Meanwhile, dysentery caused bloody diarrhea, severe abdominal pain, and gradual wasting as the digestive system became unable to process whatever food was available. Victims suffered for weeks or months, slowly weakening until their bodies simply couldn't function anymore. Families had to watch relatives suffer through prolonged, painful deaths that no amount of care or love could prevent. That's right. These diseases didn't just kill people. They destroyed the dignity and humanity of dying while traumatizing the families who watched helplessly. Parents held children who no longer recognized them. Spouses cared for partners who had been reduced to skeletal, delirious shadows of their former selves. Communities watched neighbors die horrible deaths while knowing they might be next. To be fair, some people did recover from these diseases, especially if they received care early and had access to clean water and basic nutrition. But recovery often left permanent damage, weakened immune systems, organ problems, and psychological trauma that lasted for the rest of their lives. Surviving disease during the famine often meant carrying the consequences for decades. Of course, the spread of disease was accelerated by the social disruption caused by starvation and displacement. Traditional hygiene practices broke down when soap became unaffordable and clean water became scarce. Overcrowded conditions in workhouses, emigrant ships, and refugee camps created perfect breeding grounds for epidemics that could kill hundreds of people in confined spaces. Still, perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of disease during the famine was how it particularly targeted children and elderly people who were already most vulnerable to starvation. Families that had managed to keep children alive through the worst hunger often lost them to diseases that healthy, well-fed children might have survived. It was like a cruel joke played by nature on people who had already suffered more than anyone should endure. And yet, some communities did manage to limit disease outbreaks through collective action and traditional knowledge that anticipated modern public health principles. Villages that maintained communal hygiene practices, isolated sick individuals, and shared resources for medical care often had better survival rates than communities that collapsed into individual survival mode. Sound familiar? Modern epidemiology has confirmed that community cooperation and social cohesion are crucial factors in preventing disease outbreaks during disasters. The Irish communities that survived the famine often did so by maintaining social bonds and collective action even under extreme stress. Let's be clear about the long-term health consequences for people who survived both starvation and disease during the famine years. Malnutrition during childhood caused permanent stunting, weakened immune systems, and increased susceptibility to illness throughout life. Many famine survivors suffered from chronic health problems that made them vulnerable to later diseases and reduced their life expectancy. Meanwhile, the psychological trauma of watching family members die from preventable diseases created mental health problems that wouldn't be recognized or treated for generations. Survivors often developed anxiety disorders, depression, and post-traumatic stress symptoms that affected their ability to form relationships and function normally in post-famine society. If you thought people just got over experiences like watching their children die from cholera, you misunderstand how deeply traumatic experiences affect human psychology. Famine survivors often spent the rest of their lives hypervigilant about health threats, obsessive about hygiene and medical care, and unable to fully trust that disasters wouldn't strike again. That's right, the medical horrors of the famine created psychological wounds that were passed down through generations. Children of famine survivors grew up with parents who were anxious about health and safety, creating family patterns of worry and hypervigilance that persisted long after the original threats had disappeared. To be fair, some of these psychological adaptations probably helped families survive later health crises and disasters. The heightened awareness of disease symptoms, emphasis on hygiene and medical care, and preparations for health emergencies that developed during the famine years became valuable survival skills in pre-antibiotic societies where epidemic diseases remained constant threats. Of course, the medical catastrophe of the famine also revealed the profound inadequacy of Ireland's healthcare infrastructure and the British government's approach to public health in colonial territories. Hospitals were overwhelmed, medical supplies were inadequate, and there was no systematic approach to preventing or treating epidemic diseases among vulnerable populations. Still, the crisis did lead to some improvements in medical knowledge and public health practices that benefited later generations. Doctors who worked during the famine gained experience with epidemic diseases that informed later medical practice. The recognition that poverty and disease were connected helped develop understanding of social determinants of health that wouldn't be fully accepted until the 20th century. And yet, These medical advances came at an enormous cost in human suffering. That could have been prevented with better public health policies and social support systems. The diseases that killed hundreds of thousands during the famine were preventable with adequate nutrition, clean water, sanitation, and basic medical care, resources that existed but weren't made available to Irish populations. Meanwhile, the international medical community largely ignored the Irish famine as a learning opportunity, missing chances to develop better approaches to treating malnutrition and epidemic diseases during humanitarian crises. The suffering in Ireland was seen as a local problem, rather than an opportunity to advance medical knowledge that could help future disaster victims. If you thought the medical horrors of the Irish famine might shock the international community into developing better humanitarian medical responses, you'd overestimate how much people care about distant suffering when it doesn't affect them directly. The diseases and deaths in Ireland were noted but not seriously studied by medical professionals in other countries. That sound familiar? Modern humanitarian medical crises often receive inadequate international attention and support, with medical knowledge and resources concentrated in wealthy countries, while preventable diseases continue killing people in disaster zones around the world. Let's be honest about what the medical aspects of the Irish famine reveal about the relationship between poverty, politics, and public health. The diseases that killed famine victims weren't mysterious or exotic. They were preventable illnesses that thrived in conditions of poverty and social disruption. Medical intervention could have saved thousands of lives, but it required political will and resource allocation that weren't forthcoming. That's right. Understanding the medical catastrophe of the Irish famine requires recognizing that most of the deaths weren't inevitable consequences of natural disaster. They were preventable results of political choices about resource allocation, public health priorities, and the value of Irish lives relative to British economic and ideological interests. Of course, just because the potatoes started growing again doesn't mean everything went back to normal like some fairy tale with a happy ending. That's right. We need to talk about what happened after the immediate crisis ended, because the aftermath of the Irish famine lasted far longer than the famine itself. When a society loses 25% of its population in 4 years, the effects ripple through generations like stones thrown into still water, creating waves that reach shores nobody anticipated. Let's be honest about what Ireland looked like by 1850. Entire regions had been depopulated through death and emigration, creating landscapes that looked like post-apocalyptic movie sets. Villages that had existed for centuries were abandoned ruins with grass growing through collapsed roofs. Agricultural systems that had sustained millions of people had collapsed. Traditional social structures had disintegrated. It was like trying to rebuild a civilization from scratch, except the survivors were traumatized, impoverished, and had no reason to trust that things wouldn't collapse again. Meanwhile, the people who remained in Ireland weren't randomly distributed across the population. They were the survivors of a selection process that favored certain groups over others. The elderly, sick, and very young had died disproportionately. The strongest and most ambitious had emigrated. What remained was a population skewed toward middle-aged people who were too poor to emigrate, but hardy enough to survive starvation and disease. That sound familiar? Every major disaster creates these demographic distortions that affect society for decades afterwards. World wars, epidemics, and economic collapses all leave behind populations that are missing entire age cohorts or social groups. And these gaps shape everything from economic development to cultural transmission. To be fair, the end of the immediate crisis did bring some genuine improvements to Irish life that helped prevent future disasters. The potato varieties that replaced the failed Irish lumper were more genetically diverse and disease-resistant. Agricultural techniques slowly improved as farmers learned from the disaster. Government relief programs, however inadequate, had established precedents for state intervention in crisis situations. Still, these improvements came at an enormous cost in human suffering and social disruption that couldn't be justified by any reasonable cost-benefit analysis. The Ireland that emerged from the famine was fundamentally different from the Ireland that had entered it. Traditional Gaelic culture, which had survived centuries of conquest and colonization, was devastated by the famine in ways that military force had never achieved. And yet, perhaps the most important change was psychological rather than demographic or economic. The famine had shattered Irish confidence in traditional survival strategies and social institutions. People who had trusted in community mutual aid, landlord paternalism, and government protection discovered that all of these systems could fail simultaneously when crisis struck. If you thought this trauma might fade quickly as conditions improved, you underestimate how deeply collective disasters affect social psychology. The famine created a persistent anxiety about food security, economic stability, and political reliability that influenced Irish behavior for generations. It was like developing post-traumatic stress disorder at a societal level, with entire communities exhibiting symptoms of hypervigilance and emotional numbing. Let's be clear about how this played out in practical terms. Irish farmers who survived the famine became obsessively focused on avoiding dependence on any single crop or economic strategy. They diversified their agriculture, saved money compulsively, and maintained emergency food stores long after the crisis had passed. The improvident Irish peasant stereotype was replaced by cautious, conservative farming practices that prioritize security over efficiency. That's right. The famine transformed Irish agricultural culture from subsistence survival to anxious accumulation. Farmers who had once lived from harvest to harvest now planned years in advance, maintained multiple income sources, and viewed any form of economic risk as potentially catastrophic. The trauma of starvation created a culture of excessive caution that persisted long after starvation was no longer a realistic threat. Meanwhile, the famine's demographic effects created long-term changes in Irish social structure that lasted well into the 20th century. The massive population decline meant that landholdings could be consolidated into larger, more economically viable units. The traditional pattern of subdividing farms among multiple children was replaced by inheritance systems that kept farms intact, but forced most children to emigrate or remain unmarried. Of course, this consolidation process wasn't automatic or painless. It required decades of gradual adjustment as families learned new inheritance practices, marriage patterns, and economic strategies. Many communities struggled with conflicts between traditional obligations to provide for all children and economic necessities that required concentrating resources on single heirs. To be fair, some of these changes probably improved Irish economic prospects in the long run. Larger farms were more efficient and productive than the tiny plots that had dominated pre-famine agriculture. Reduced population pressure meant higher wages for laborers and better living standards for those who remained. From a purely economic perspective, the famine had forced beneficial structural adjustments that might have taken much longer to achieve through gradual change. Still, describing demographic catastrophe as beneficial structural adjustment reveals the cold logic that treats human suffering as statistical data rather than lived experience. The families who died or emigrated might have had different opinions about whether their sacrifice was worth improved efficiency for survivors. Sound familiar? The tendency to describe humanitarian disasters in economic terms, to focus on aggregate outcomes rather than individual suffering, didn't disappear with the Victorian era. Modern discussions of economic creative destruction often use similar language to justify the costs of economic change in human terms. And yet, the most significant long-term consequence of the famine wasn't economic or demographic. It was political. The crisis had permanently damaged the legitimacy of British rule in Ireland by demonstrating the government's willingness to let Irish people starve while maintaining ideological purity about free markets. This created the political foundation for Irish nationalism that would eventually lead to independence. Let's be honest, Irish resistance to British rule existed long before the famine, but it had been primarily cultural and religious rather than political. The famine transformed this diffuse resentment into focused political opposition by providing clear evidence that British rule was literally a matter of life and death for Irish people. Meanwhile, the Irish diaspora created by famine emigration provided both financial resources and international political support for Irish independence movements. Irish Americans, in particular, maintained fierce hatred for British rule and were willing to contribute money and political influence to support Irish nationalism. The famine had created a global Irish constituency that could pressure Britain. Through international diplomacy, if you thought the British government might learn from the famine experience and improve their governance of Ireland, you'd be disappointed but not surprised by their capacity for self-justification. Official analyses of the crisis blamed Irish character defects and agricultural backwardness rather than acknowledging policy failures. The lessons learned were about how to manage similar crises more efficiently, not about preventing them through better governance. That's right. The British response to criticism of their famine policies was essentially, we did the best we could with the resources available. And anyway, it taught the Irish valuable lessons about economic modernization. It's like a doctor claiming credit for curing a disease they caused through malpractice, then writing a medical paper about their innovative treatment methods. To be fair, some individual officials and politicians did acknowledge that mistakes had been made during the famine years. But these acknowledgments were usually framed as tactical errors in implementing correct policies, rather than fundamental problems with the policies themselves. The ideology that had caused the disaster remained intact and ready to cause future disasters. Of course, the famine also accelerated existing trends toward agricultural modernization and commercialization that would have happened eventually anyway. Irish farming became more integrated with British and international markets, more focused on cash crops rather than subsistence production, and more efficient in terms of output per acre and per worker. Still, this modernization came at the cost of traditional rural culture that had sustained Irish communities for centuries. Gaelic language use declined rapidly after the famine, partly because of population loss, and partly because English became necessary for economic survival in the post-famine economy. Traditional music, storytelling, and craft traditions also declined as communities dispersed and priorities shifted toward economic recovery. And yet, the famine also inspired efforts to preserve and revive Irish culture that would become central to later nationalist movements. The trauma of cultural loss during the famine years motivated scholars, artists, and political activists to document and maintain Irish traditions before they disappeared entirely. The famine created both cultural destruction and cultural preservation movements simultaneously. Sound familiar? Major disasters often produce both destruction of traditional cultures and efforts to preserve them. The threat of loss can motivate preservation efforts, but it can also accelerate the very processes of change that threaten traditional ways of life. Let's be clear about the economic transformation that followed the famine. Ireland's economy became much more integrated with Britain and international markets, but this integration was based on Ireland's role as a supplier of agricultural products and labor rather than independent economic power. The famine had reinforced Ireland's colonial economic status rather than challenging it. Meanwhile, the post-famine period saw significant improvements in Irish infrastructure, education, and living standards. But these improvements were often designed to serve British economic and political interests rather than Irish needs. Railway construction, for example, facilitated the extraction of Irish agricultural products to British markets rather than developing internal Irish economic networks. If you thought economic development would reduce Irish nationalism by improving living conditions, you'd misunderstand the relationship between material welfare and political identity. Better roads, schools, and communications actually made Irish people more aware of their subordinate status within the British system and more capable of organizing effective resistance. That's right. Many of the improvements implemented after the famine actually strengthened rather than weakened Irish nationalism. Education taught Irish people to read newspapers and political literature. Transportation allowed for better political organization. Economic development created Irish middle classes who had the resources and leisure time for political activism. To be fair, some Irish people did become more reconciled to British rule as living conditions improved after the famine. The development of Catholic education, the expansion of political rights, and gradual improvements in economic opportunities convinced some that reform within the British system was possible and preferable to revolutionary change. Of course, these improvements came far too late to heal the wounds created by the famine experience. For most Irish people, the memory of British indifference to mass starvation overshadowed later improvements in governance. The famine had demonstrated that British rule could be literally fatal to Irish interests, and no amount of subsequent reform could erase that lesson. Still, the post-famine period did see genuine efforts by some British politicians to address Irish grievances and improve British governance of Ireland. Land reform legislation, investment in Irish infrastructure, and gradual expansion of Irish political rights represented real attempts to create a stable, prosperous Ireland within the British system. And yet, these reform efforts were undermined by the fundamental contradiction of trying to maintain colonial control while providing equal treatment. British politicians wanted Irish loyalty, but weren't willing to grant Irish independence. They wanted Irish economic development, but within a system that primarily served British interests. These contradictions made long-term stability impossible. Let's be honest about what the famine aftermath reveals about the relationship between humanitarian crises and political change. Disasters don't automatically produce progressive reforms or social justice. They can just as easily reinforce existing power structures, blame victims for their suffering, and create new forms of exploitation disguised as assistance. Meanwhile, the Irish famine established patterns of disaster response and post-crisis reconstruction that would be repeated throughout the British Empire and beyond. Natural disasters would be used as opportunities to implement unpopular economic policies. Relief efforts would be designed to reinforce rather than challenge existing social hierarchies. Recovery programs would prioritize economic efficiency over social justice. If you thought the Irish famine might serve as a cautionary tale that would prevent similar disasters in the future, you'd be both right and wrong. It did become a cautionary tale for colonized peoples about the dangers of depending on imperial governments for protection. But for imperial administrators, it became a template for managing future crises while maintaining political control. Sound familiar? The lessons learned from humanitarian disasters often depend on who's doing the learning and what their interests are. The same events can teach completely different lessons to different groups of people, depending on their position in existing power structures. That's right. Understanding the aftermath of the Irish famine isn't just about Irish history. It's about understanding how societies respond to collective trauma and how power structures adapt to survive challenges to their legitimacy. The famine changed Ireland forever, but it also revealed patterns of human behavior that remain relevant today. To be fair, the Irish famine did produce some genuine improvements in disaster preparedness, and humanitarian response that benefited later generations. The international attention it received helped establish patterns of international relief aid that would be used in future crises. The documentation of suffering during the famine years contributed to developing more systematic approaches to understanding and preventing mass starvation. Still, these improvements were largely incidental to the main purposes of post-famine reconstruction, which focused on maintaining political stability and economic productivity rather than preventing future humanitarian disasters. The lessons learned were primarily about crisis management rather than crisis prevention. And yet, perhaps the most important legacy of the famine aftermath was its demonstration that entire societies could survive catastrophic disruption and eventually rebuild, though not without permanent scars. Ireland didn't disappear or become permanently dysfunctional after losing 25% of its population. Instead, it developed new social institutions, economic systems, and cultural practices that enabled recovery and eventual prosperity. Of course, this recovery took generations rather than years, and it came at enormous costs in human suffering and cultural loss. The Ireland that emerged from the famine was fundamentally different from the Ireland that had entered it, and many would argue that some of what was lost was more valuable than what was gained. Of course, we've spent a lot of time talking about government policies, landlord decisions, and economic theories. But let's be honest about who actually kept Irish society functioning during the worst humanitarian disaster in the country's history. While men were dying in ditches, emigrating to America, or making speeches in Parliament, Irish women were performing the daily miracles that kept families alive. That's right. We need to talk about the unsung heroes of the famine, the mothers, wives, daughters, and sisters who somehow held civilization together when everything else was falling apart. Let's be clear about something. Irish women in the 1840s had virtually no legal rights, no political power, and no economic independence. They couldn't own property, vote, or make legal contracts. In the eyes of the law, they were essentially children who needed male supervision to function in society. But when the famine struck and traditional male authority structures collapsed, these supposedly helpless creatures became the backbone of survival. Meanwhile, understanding women's experiences during the famine requires recognizing that they faced all the same horrors as men: starvation, disease, homelessness, grief, while also carrying the additional burden of keeping families together. When potatoes rotted in the fields, it was women who had to figure out how to feed children with no food. When fathers died or emigrated, it was women who had to become sole providers while maintaining the fiction that they were still dependent. Sound familiar? It should, because this pattern of women carrying disproportionate burdens during crises, while receiving minimal recognition, hasn't exactly disappeared. Modern disasters consistently reveal that women bear the heaviest loads during emergencies, while being excluded from decision-making about responses and recovery. To be fair, some aspects of traditional Irish society did provide women with informal power and respect that wasn't reflected in legal systems. Irish mothers were typically the family financial managers, making decisions about resource allocation, food distribution, and household priorities. They were the keepers of cultural traditions, the primary educators of children, and the centers of extended family networks. Still, these informal sources of power became both blessing and curse during the famine years. Women's traditional responsibility for family welfare meant they were blamed when families suffered, even when the causes were completely beyond their control. Mothers who couldn't feed their children faced not just grief, but guilt, as if maternal love should have been powerful enough to create food from nothing. And yet, Irish women developed survival strategies during the famine that would have impressed modern emergency management experts. They organized informal networks for sharing scarce resources, created systems for caring for orphan children, and maintained community connections that helped families navigate the crisis. It was like running a disaster relief operation without any official authority or resources. If you thought women's traditional domestic skills were inadequate, preparation for famine survival, you underestimate the complexity of managing a household with no money, no food, and no reliable social support. Irish women had to become experts in resource management, nutrition, medicine, psychology, and social organization, all while maintaining the appearance of feminine helplessness that society demanded. Let's be honest about what this meant in practical terms. When families had only enough food for one meal per day, women had to decide who got how much of what little was available. When children were dying of preventable diseases, women had to provide medical care with folk remedies and prayer. When eviction threatened, women had to negotiate with landlords and bailiffs who saw them as irrelevant obstacles to property management. That's right. Women during the famine were essentially running small-scale humanitarian operations under impossible conditions. They triaged medical emergencies, allocated scarce resources, maintained morale, and coordinated survival strategies, all while being told by law and custom that they were incapable of making important decisions. Meanwhile, the famine created new opportunities for women to exercise leadership and independence, even as it destroyed traditional support systems. When men emigrated or died, women often became heads of households by default. Some started small businesses selling whatever they could produce. Others organized community relief efforts or became informal leaders in their villages. Of course, these opportunities came at enormous personal cost. Women who had to support families alone faced not just economic challenges, but social disapproval from communities that viewed independent women as threats to natural order. Single mothers, widows, and abandoned wives were often blamed for their circumstances and excluded from traditional support networks. To be fair, some women did find genuine empowerment through famine experiences that taught them they were capable of much more than society had allowed. Women who successfully managed family survival, organized community responses, or built small businesses often gained confidence and skills that served them well in later life. But celebrating women's resilience during the famine shouldn't obscure the fundamental injustice of a system that forced them to carry impossible burdens without providing adequate resources or recognition. Irish women succeeded despite the system, not because of it. Sound familiar? Modern discussions of women's resilience during disasters often fall into the same trap of celebrating survival while ignoring the structural inequalities that make such extraordinary resilience necessary in the first place. Still, perhaps the most remarkable aspect of women's famine experiences was how they maintained cultural traditions and family connections that kept Irish identity alive during the darkest years. Women were the primary keepers of Irish language, music, storytelling, and traditional knowledge. When formal institutions collapsed, informal women's networks preserved the cultural heritage that would later fuel Irish nationalism. And yet, women's cultural preservation work was often invisible to contemporary observers and later historians, who focused on more dramatic political and economic developments. The quiet work of teaching children traditional songs, maintaining family histories, and preserving customary practices seemed less important than emigration statistics or government policies. Let's be clear about the medical challenges that women faced during the famine years. They were expected to provide health care for their families with no medical training, no reliable medicines, and no access to professional medical advice. When children developed typhus or dysentery, mothers had to attempt treatment with whatever folk remedies they could remember or improvise. Meanwhile, women's own health needs were consistently ignored during the crisis. Pregnant women gave birth without adequate nutrition or medical care. Nursing mothers tried to breastfeed children while they themselves were starving. Women suffering from illness or injury received whatever care was left over after men and children had been attended to. If you thought pregnancy and childbirth were dangerous for women under normal 19th century conditions, imagine giving birth. During a famine while living in a one-room cabin with no clean water, no proper food, and no medical assistance. Maternal mortality rates during the famine were catastrophic, but these deaths were rarely recorded or mourned publicly. That's right, women were dying in enormous numbers during the famine, but their deaths were often invisible because they happened in domestic spaces rather than public ones. Men who died of starvation in workhouses or on roads were counted and recorded. Women who died in childbirth or from exhaustion while caring for families often disappeared from historical records entirely. To be fair, some women did receive recognition for extraordinary service during the famine years. Religious sisters who ran orphanages and hospitals became local heroes. Quaker women who organized relief efforts gained international attention. A few wealthy women who contributed to charity efforts were praised in newspapers and official reports. Of course, this recognition was typically framed in terms of traditional feminine virtues rather than leadership or competence. Women were praised for their charity, self-sacrifice, and maternal instincts rather than their organizational skills, strategic thinking, or political insight. Even women's most impressive achievements were interpreted through the lens of gender stereotypes. Still, the famine did create some lasting changes in how Irish society thought about women's capabilities and roles. Women who had successfully managed family survival or community organizations during the crisis couldn't easily be dismissed as helpless dependents afterward. The gap between women's demonstrated abilities and their legal status became harder to ignore. And yet, most of these changes took generations to translate into actual improvements in women's legal and political status. The women who survived the famine often spent the rest of their lives fighting for recognition of rights and capabilities they had already proven during the crisis years. Sound familiar? Women's emergency leadership during disasters rarely translates into permanent improvements in their status once normal conditions return. The same societies that depend on women's resilience during crises often resist recognizing women's leadership during recovery periods. Let's be honest about the emotional toll that famine survival took on Irish women. They watched their children waste away from hunger while being unable to provide food. They nursed dying family members with no medicine or professional help. They made impossible choices about resource allocation that haunted them for the rest of their lives. Meanwhile, women were expected to maintain family morale and provide emotional support for other family members while dealing with their own trauma and grief. Mothers were supposed to comfort children who were crying from hunger while hiding their own despair. Wives were expected to support husbands who had lost their ability to provide for families. If you thought women's traditional roles as emotional caretakers might have provided some protection from psychological trauma, you misunderstand how witnessing suffering affects human psychology. Women who spent years watching loved ones die while being powerless to help often develop severe depression, anxiety, and other mental health problems that went unrecognized and untreated. That's right, the same women who were praised for their strength and resilience during the famine often suffered from psychological wounds that never fully healed. The cultural expectation that women should be endlessly nurturing and optimistic prevented recognition or treatment of their mental health needs. To be fair, women's traditional support networks did provide some psychological protection during the crisis. Female neighbors, relatives, and friends offered each other emotional support, practical assistance, and shared coping strategies. These informal networks sometimes function better than formal relief programs. Of course, these same Networks also meant that women's grief and trauma were often shared experiences rather than individual problems. When entire communities were suffering, individual women couldn't escape into denial or isolation. They had to continue functioning for the sake of others, even when they were psychologically devastated. Still, perhaps the most important legacy of women's famine experiences was how they contributed to later Irish independence movements and social reforms. Women who had proven their capability during the crisis became advocates for political change. The daughters and granddaughters of famine survivors often became leaders in women's rights, labor organizing, and nationalist politics. And yet, connecting women's famine experiences to later political developments requires recognizing that their contributions were often erased from official histories that focused on male leaders and formal organizations. Women's political influence operated through informal networks and behind-the-scenes activities that left fewer historical traces. Let's be clear about what studying women's famine experiences can teach us about gender, disaster, and resilience. Women's survival strategies during the Irish famine demonstrated remarkable creativity, leadership, and organizational skill under impossible conditions. But celebrating their achievements shouldn't obscure the systemic inequalities that made such extraordinary efforts necessary. Meanwhile, the patterns established during the Irish famine, women carrying disproportionate burdens during disasters, receiving minimal recognition for their contributions, and being excluded from formal decision-making about responses, continue to characterize emergency situations around the world today. If you thought understanding women's experiences during the Irish famine was just a matter of historical curiosity, you're missing the ongoing relevance of these patterns for understanding modern humanitarian crises. Women continue to bear the heaviest burdens during disasters while being marginalized in official responses and recovery planning. That's right, the Irish women who held their families and communities together during the famine years established templates for female disaster response that remain relevant for understanding how women navigate crises today. Their stories aren't just historical artifacts. They're ongoing lessons about gender, power, and survival that continue to shape how societies respond to disasters. So here we are, over 150 years later, and people still argue about what the Irish Potato Famine really means. Was it genocide? Criminal negligence? Economic ideology run amok? A natural disaster made worse by human failure? Let's be honest. It was probably all of these things simultaneously, which is why it continues to generate such passionate debate and why its lessons remain disturbingly relevant today. Meanwhile, if you thought we'd learned enough from the Irish famine to prevent similar disasters, I've got some unfortunate news for you. Mass starvation, forced migration, and ideologically driven indifference to human suffering didn't disappear with the Victorian era. They just found new forms, new justifications, and new victims. That's right, the patterns we've been exploring. Using abstract principles to justify concrete suffering, blaming victims for their circumstances, prioritizing economic ideology over human life. These didn't become historical curiosities. They became templates that have been applied repeatedly throughout the modern world. Sound familiar? It should, because versions of these same dynamics are playing out right now in refugee camps, climate disasters, economic crises, and public health emergencies around the world. The specific details change, but the fundamental human tendency to prioritize ideology over humanity remains depressingly consistent. To be fair, modern disaster response is generally more effective and humane than what Ireland experienced in the 1840s. We have international relief organizations, better transportation and communication systems, and at least theoretical commitments to human rights that didn't exist in the Victorian era. When disasters strike today, Help usually arrives faster and more effectively than anything Charles Trevelyan could have imagined. Still, these improvements in technical capacity haven't eliminated the political and ideological factors that turned the potato disease into a humanitarian catastrophe. Modern disasters still reveal the same patterns of neglect, discrimination, and victim blaming that characterized British responses to Irish starvation. The tools have improved, but the underlying human dynamics remain remarkably unchanged. Of course, one of the most important legacies of the Irish famine is how it demonstrates the relationship between seemingly natural disasters and human political choices. The potato blight was a natural phenomenon, but the mass starvation that followed was a political choice disguised as economic necessity. Understanding this distinction is crucial for making sense of modern humanitarian crises. Let's be clear about what this means in practice. When we see people dying of preventable diseases, lacking access to clean water, or fleeing climate disasters, these aren't simply natural phenomena beyond human control. They're the predictable results of political systems that prioritize some people's welfare over others. Just like the system that let Irish people starve while food was exported to England. And yet, perhaps the most important lesson of the Irish famine isn't about the cruelty of particular governments or ideologies. It's about the human capacity for both extraordinary callousness and extraordinary resilience. The same species that created policies allowing mass starvation also produced individuals who risked everything to help strangers, communities that shared their last scraps of food with neighbors, and survivors who rebuilt their lives from nothing. Meanwhile, the global Irish diaspora created by famine immigration became one of the most successful examples of how displaced populations can maintain cultural identity while adapting to new circumstances. Irish communities around the world preserved traditions, supported homeland politics, and eventually achieved remarkable social and economic success without completely assimilating into their host societies. If you thought this success story proves that forced migration can have positive outcomes, you'd be right, but you'd also be missing the point. The Irish diaspora succeeded despite their traumatic origins, not because of them. Their achievements shouldn't be used to justify the policies that forced them to leave Ireland in the first place. That's right. Survivor success stories often get misused to minimize the significance of the disasters that created them. Look how well they turned out becomes an excuse for the policies that caused unnecessary suffering, as if good eventual outcomes justify bad immediate choices. Sound familiar? Modern discussions of refugee integration, economic displacement, and climate migration often fall into the same trap of focusing on successful adaptation while ignoring the preventable suffering that made adaptation necessary. Let's be honest about what studying the Irish famine should teach us about evaluating modern crises. When governments claim that harsh policies are necessary for long-term benefits, when officials argue that immediate suffering will produce eventual improvements, when leaders blame victims for their circumstances, these are warning signs that ideology has become more important than humanity. To be fair, not every government policy that causes short-term hardship is equivalent to the British response to the Irish famine. Sometimes difficult decisions really are necessary for long-term benefit, and sometimes immediate intervention really would make things worse in the long run. The challenge is distinguishing between genuine necessity and ideological rationalization. Of course, this distinction is easier to make in retrospect than in real time. Charles Trevelyan and his colleagues probably believed they were making difficult but necessary choices for the greater good. The fact that they were catastrophically wrong doesn't mean their intentions were necessarily evil, which is actually more frightening than simple malice. Still, the Irish famine does provide some useful criteria for evaluating modern policy choices. When the people making decisions don't have to live with the consequences, when abstract principles matter more than concrete suffering, when victim blaming replaces policy analysis, these are signs that ideology has overwhelmed judgment. And yet, perhaps the most disturbing lesson of the Irish famine is how normal, decent people can become complicit in extraordinary suffering through institutional structures and ideological frameworks. Most of the officials involved weren't monsters. They were ordinary people making rational choices within irrational systems. Meanwhile, this suggests that preventing future disasters requires more than just replacing bad people with good people. It requires changing the systems that reward callousness and punish compassion, that prioritize abstract principles over human welfare, and that insulate decision-makers from the consequences of their choices. If you thought understanding historical disasters would provide clear guidance for avoiding future ones, you'd be disappointed. History doesn't repeat itself exactly, and the specific circumstances that created the Irish famine can't happen again in precisely the same way. But the underlying human dynamics that enabled mass starvation amid abundance remain as relevant as ever. That's right. The value of studying the Irish famine isn't that it provides a precise template for recognizing future disasters, but that it reveals persistent patterns in how power operates during crises. Understanding these patterns won't prevent all future suffering, but it might help us recognize when we're heading down similar paths. Let's be clear about why this matters today. Climate change is creating conditions for mass displacement and resource scarcity that could easily trigger humanitarian crises on the scale of the Irish famine. Rising sea levels, changing weather patterns, and ecological disruption are already forcing people to choose between staying in increasingly uninhabitable places or risking dangerous journeys to uncertain destinations that sound familiar. The parallels between 19th century Irish immigrants and 21st century climate refugees are striking and disturbing. Both involve people forced to leave their homes due to environmental changes beyond their control. Both involve dangerous journeys to places where they face discrimination and exploitation. Both reveal how environmental disasters become humanitarian crises through political choices about who deserves help and protection. To be fair, modern international law and institutions provide better frameworks for responding to refugee crises than anything available during the Irish famine. The principle of asylum, international relief organizations, and global communication networks create possibilities for more effective humanitarian responses. Still, these institutional improvements haven't eliminated the political and ideological barriers that prevent effective action during humanitarian crises. Modern refugee policies still prioritize national interests over human welfare, still blame victims for their circumstances, and still treat mass displacement as someone else's problem rather than a global responsibility. Of course, one crucial difference between the Irish famine and modern crises is the availability of information. Unlike the 1840s, when news traveled slowly and government officials could control narratives about distant events, modern disasters unfold in real time before global audiences. It's much harder to maintain ignorance or denial about suffering when it's documented and broadcast immediately. And yet, information availability hasn't eliminated indifference to suffering. It's just changed how that indifference gets expressed and justified. Modern audiences can watch humanitarian disasters unfold on their screens while maintaining psychological distance through various forms of rationalization and blame shifting. Meanwhile, the Irish famine established patterns of international humanitarian response that continue to shape how we think about disaster relief. The idea that wealthy countries have obligations to help disaster victims, that private charity should supplement government action, and that international coordination can improve relief effectiveness All of these concepts were developed or refined during responses to the Irish crisis. If you thought these humanitarian principles have steadily expanded and strengthened since the 1840s, you'd be both right and wrong. International humanitarian law has indeed developed sophisticated frameworks for protecting civilian populations during disasters and conflicts. But these legal principles are often ignored or circumvented when they conflict with political interests. That's right. We've gotten better at articulating humanitarian principles, but we haven't necessarily gotten better at implementing them when doing so requires sacrificing other priorities. The gap between humanitarian rhetoric and humanitarian action remains as wide today as it was during the Irish Famine. Let's be honest about what this means for our responsibilities as global citizens in an interconnected world. The Irish Famine happened during an era when most people had limited information about distant events and limited ability to influence government policies. Modern technology gives us both better information and better tools for political action. Of course, having better tools doesn't automatically mean using them more effectively. Modern humanitarian crises often generate enormous public attention and concern, but translating that concern into effective political action remains challenging. It's easier to feel bad about distant suffering than to change the policies that enable it. Still, the Irish diaspora's long-term influence on international politics demonstrates that humanitarian crises can have political consequences that last for generations. The Irish Americans who supported Irish independence, opposed British foreign policy, and influenced American attitudes toward immigration were motivated by collective memories of British indifference during the famine years. And yet, this also suggests that failing to respond effectively to current humanitarian crises will have long-term political consequences that we can't fully predict or control. Today's refugees and displaced populations will remember how they were treated, and their descendants may have opportunities to influence international relations in ways that reflect those memories. Sound familiar? The political consequences of humanitarian action or inaction often emerge decades after the original crisis, creating incentives for long-term thinking about disaster response that are easily ignored when immediate political pressures favor short-term solutions. Meanwhile, perhaps the most important legacy of the Irish Famine is its demonstration that ordinary people can survive extraordinary disasters and rebuild their lives from almost nothing. The resilience, creativity, and mutual aid that enabled Irish survival during the famine years remain inspiring examples of human capacity to endure and overcome seemingly insurmountable challenges. To be fair, celebrating human resilience shouldn't become an excuse for the policies and circumstances that make such resilience necessary. The fact that people can survive terrible things doesn't make those terrible things acceptable or inevitable. Of course, understanding how people survive disasters can provide valuable insights for helping others facing similar challenges. The community networks, cultural practices, and individual strategies that enabled Irish famine survival offer practical lessons for modern disaster preparedness and humanitarian response. Let's be clear about the bottom line here. The Irish Potato Famine wasn't just a historical tragedy that happened to some people long ago in a place far away. It was a demonstration of human possibilities, both terrible and inspiring, that remain relevant as long as people face disasters, displacement, and the choices of those in power. That's right. Studying the Irish Famine isn't an academic exercise in historical curiosity. It's a masterclass in how ideology, power, and human nature interact during crises. Understanding these dynamics won't prevent all future suffering, but it might help us recognize and resist the patterns that enable preventable disasters. And if you've made it this far through this story, you've already demonstrated more interest in understanding historical suffering than many of the officials who were responsible for responding to it, which suggests that maybe, just maybe, we're capable of doing better when our turn comes to make choices about how to respond to other people's disasters. After all, if there's one thing the Irish famine teaches us, it's that the choices we make about other people's suffering define who we are as much as anything else we do. The victims of the famine didn't choose their circumstances, but everyone else chose how to respond to those circumstances. We'll be judged by similar choices, whether we recognize them or not. Meanwhile, the Irish are still here, still telling stories, still remembering. And that might be the most important lesson of all, that human dignity can survive even the worst. Attempts to destroy it, and that memory can be more powerful than the forces that try to erase it. The famine ended, but the story continues. And how that story continues depends partly on whether we've learned anything from how it began.